In G.K. Chesterton's novel, The Ball and the Cross, the Catholic Evan MacIan challenges the atheist James Turnbull, saying, quote, "The world left to itself grows wilder than any creed. That is the only real question, whether the church is really madder than the world. Let the rationalists run their own race, and let us see where they end. If the world has some healthy balance other than God, let the world find it. Does the world find it? Cut the world loose. Does the world stand on its own end? Does it stand or does it stagger?" End quote. Dale Ahlquist on G.K. Chesterton's novel, The Ball and the Cross, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization and Culture podcast from Word on Fire. Dale Ahlquist is president of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, creator and host of the EWTN series G.K. Chesterton, the Apostle of Common Sense, and publisher of Gilbert Magazine. The author of 6 books and editor of 14, Dale is a senior fellow of the Chesterton Library at London and has been called, quote, probably the greatest living authority on the life and work of G.K. Chesterton, end quote. Dale's given more than 900 lectures at universities, conferences, and other institutions, including Yale, Columbia, Cornell, Notre Dame, Oxford, the Vatican Forum in Rome, and even the House of Lords in London. He is also the co-founder of Chesterton Academy, a top-rated Catholic classical high school in Hopkins, Minnesota, which is the flagship of the growing Chesterton Schools network, which includes nearly 60 high schools in the U.S., Canada, Italy, Iraq, and Sierra Leone. As the New Oxford Review likes to say, Ahlquist on Chesterton is like Plato on Socrates or Boswell on Johnson. Dale Ahlquist, welcome.
Well, thank you, Todd. A great pleasure to be with you always, always.
Segment 1, The Prince of Paradox. Nearly 150 years ago, there was born a man who laughed uproariously, debated fiercely, loved immensely, and wondered endlessly. He uttered such delicious morsels as, quote, fallacies do not cease to be fallacies because they become fashions, end quote. And, quote, a dead thing can go with the stream, but only a living thing can go against it, end quote. And finally, quote, if a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing badly, end quote. That man is G.K. Chesterton. Dale, who exactly is G.K. Chesterton?
Chesterton, the best way to describe him, Todd, I think, is he's a giant in every way. He's certainly a giant in terms of his genius and his literary output, his tremendous faith, but he's also just a physical giant too. A big man,
Yeah,
man who said that he was the politest man in all of England because he could stand up on a bus and offer his seat to 3 women at one time. So he has the great. We talked about paradox. The paradox about this big man is that he made himself very small. He was a giant of humility, which is, I think, a wonderful paradox. In spite of his great gifts and his great advantage over other people, he never took advantage of his advantage. He always put himself in the role of the servant and always was anxious to learn from others and was as interested, if not more interested, in what they had to say than they were in what he had to say. He was incredibly prolific. So he lived the first part of the 20th century when he did all of his writings, and during that time, probably wrote more than any other person has ever written. It's absolutely incredible, his output. Besides the 100 books that he wrote and the introductions to 200 other books, he wrote volumes of poetry. He wrote fiction and nonfiction. He wrote some very, very famous detective stories featuring a priest named Father Brown.
Mm-hmm.
But he was primarily a journalist. He wrote for the London papers, and his journalistic essays, we used to think it was about 4,000, and then we adjusted the number to 5,000,
Mm.
and now we're realizing that it's closer to 9,000
Oh my gosh.
essays that he wrote. And that's we've come up with that number because of the great work of a Norwegian bibliographer named Geir Hostes, who together with an army of volunteers has tracked down essentially all of Chesterton's writings, although we keep discovering more. But just think about 9,000 journalistic
Unbelievable.
essays. It would take basically writing an essay a day for almost 20 years to produce that. And and there's a few of us who are lucky to have read most of those. He wrote all of them. And
Yeah.
so he just cranked them out. He was always writing. His mind was always at work. And when you read his writing, you're not reading anything edited. Those are his pure thoughts coming out of his head, because no editor could touch him or keep up with him.
Before we started, and our listeners don't have the privilege of being able to see us like you and I are seeing each other. I was looking behind you and seeing the stacks of books, the lined up books from Chesterton on your shelf, and still astounding as you talk about the growing number that you're still discovering. I don't know how a person can put out that much work, but then that much work of that much quality. And so that's something I'll get into on my next question for you. And I was gonna ask you, you of all people, I would imagine, are among the most well read of Chesterton's works, and yet there must be so much more that you're discovering anew. Is that the case? I mean, do you still think there's works out there that even you have not been able to kind of digest and enjoy? What's your sense about that?
Well, at this point, the only thing we're going to be finding would be some stray essay in some obscure journal or something
Sure.
like that. Really, everything he wrote was published. I mean,
Okay.
there's in terms of unpublished, there's just a very few letters, and a few of his writings that exist in his papers. Inscriptions on books and things like that. So we're talking about a really minuscule amount of material that has not been published. But there's a whole in the last few years, there's just a whole new wealth of material that we've been discovering, thanks to the tool of the internet, having
Mhm.
old newspaper articles that we can search, and these would be reports of speeches that he gave. And he gave, well over 1,000 speeches during his lifetime, and those articles will have maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs from his talk, and sometimes more, and that's all new material that we had never considered before, and
It's
it's
amazing.
all fresh. It's so so yeah, it's a wonderful mountain of material that we keep exploring and discovering. And the thing about Chesterton, Todd, is that you can go back, as you are, I'm sure, are well aware, and read the same thing again and
Yep.
again, and it will keep yielding new truth and new revelation coming from something that you've read many times.
I'll tell you this really quickly, a personal story. I read Orthodoxy for the first time on a beach in Ixtapa, and I closed the book, and I wasn't really sure what Chesterton was talking about a lot of the time. And I said to my wife, I think this guy's kind of overrated. I think it's kind of, some of this seems nonsensical and clever and all this, but I said there's a few points I thought are brilliant, but then I'm not sure I'm getting it. Well, years would pass, more reading, more. I was on my road to the Catholic Church, more experience of the Mass, talking to priests, reading other great thinkers, coming back to Chesterton, discovering Belloc through you and others. And I was stunned when I came back to Orthodoxy again and again. And I probably read that one. That's the one I probably read about 12 or 13 times. That's the one I've read the most of, to be sure. I stunned at how wrong I was, and stunned that, kind of as Antonin Scalia tells the anecdote of his English teacher to the young man who was criticizing Shakespeare. When you're reading Shakespeare's not on trial, you are. And in this case, Todd, when you're reading Chesterton's on trial, Todd, you are. And in fact, he's right. It's been an amazing, amazing epiphany of the wisdom of Chesterton if you just stick with him and grow, and stick with him and grow some more.
Yeah, I sometimes advise people. I said, don't try to read Chesterton, just let him read you.
Good one.
Yeah.
Good one. Well said. Well said. Well said. Well, Chesterton, so a deft debater, Chesterton matched wits with the fashionable minds of his day, such as George Bernard Shaw, Clarence Darrow, Bertrand Russell. And as a prolific writer who described himself first and foremost as a journalist, Chesterton penned, as you've said, countless essays and short stories, novels, and common man apologetics. Even today, his insights are quoted widely, as he is at times forgotten. So tell me a little bit more about the keen mind of Chesterton and what made it tick.
Well, one of the things about Chester is he's just an incredibly consistent thinker. So
Mm.
when you're even though he had his own path of faith, he didn't become a Catholic till 1922, so two decades or more after he started writing. But he had just a very well formed mind at the very beginning of his writing career, and it's very difficult to date his writing. If you just were handed a
Yeah.
few paragraphs, you wouldn't be able to determine if it was written before his conversion or after his conversion. That's how consistent his thinking was. His Catholic conversion would represent a completion of his thought, although he considered it the beginning of his thinking. He said that was when he learned how to think, and that's an incredible thing for someone to say. But it was a very intellectual conversion. So what you find in him is, first of all, a sense of wonder that permeates his writings. This gift of being alive, this gift of God's creation that is new to us every day. He said, we should look out on the day, each day, as if it's the first day of creation, because
Mhm.
that's the way to observe the world, to look at familiar things as if you're seeing them for the first time. And that sense of wonder always gives you a sense of gratitude. So everything that Chesterton writes about is informed with thanks.
Mm.
And that's a very humble approach to everything. So he's always letting the truth inform him. At the same time, he has this intuitive sense of the truth, so that he sheds light on everything that he is
Mm.
considering. So wonder is the first basic principle that comes out of Chester. And then you've already mentioned paradox. Paradox is not only his technique of writing, but it reflects his understanding of truth. That the truth itself is unexpected. It comes to us not the way we would have imagined it be. So it comes as a shock, as a surprise. As a paradox seems to be the opposite of what we think is true, and yet when we consider it, we realize it's right. So think of some of Chesterton's paradoxes, such as the self is more distant than any star.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just consider that for a while. We
Yeah.
we do understand when we look up at the heavens how those stars work. We know a lot about them, but we still don't know how our own mind and soul works. That's still a mystery to
Right.
us.
Right.
And he says you can always be blind to a thing as long as it's big enough.
Yeah.
And so you can't see the thing that's big because you're too close to it. You have to back up to see it. And Chester says that's the case with the Catholic Church, that most people are too close to it to really understand it or see it for what it is. They're affected by the thing they're closest to, and to really to make an honest assessment of the Catholic Church, you have to back up and look at the whole
Yeah.
thing and get the whole picture, and then you see how comprehensive and you know how true it is in its bigness. Yeah, and the other thing about paradox is that that's really the key to understanding the whole Bible. The
Yeah.
Bible is
Yeah.
full of paradox. That the first shall be last, and the last shall be first, and
Right.
God Himself comes to us as a baby, and God Himself dies on a cross for us. Those are all ways that we would not have written the story, right?
Exactly.
And so Chesterton's paradox is, for some people, irritating, and yet it is such an enlightening way to look at the world. These truths that seem to be in conflict with each other, yet are both true at the same time. And I think the other thing about Chesterton is his great fight for the common man,
Mm.
and his defense of the little things, and and so he's really a champion of Catholic social teaching and justice that really does add to his completeness. I think one of the great great lines from Orthodoxy, which I seem to end up quoting every day, and which I think I'm about to quote right now.
Yes, here it
So,
comes.
yeah, he says, when a society breaks down, um, two things happen. The vices run wild, and they do
Mm.
great damage. But he says the virtues also run wild, and the virtues do even greater damage because the virtues are wandering alone and they start doing war with each other.
Yes.
Thus, you'll have people on one side who care only about truth, and the people on the other side who care only about pity. But the people who care only about truth, their truth is pitiless, and the people who care only about pity, their pity is untruthful. And if that doesn't perfectly describe the polarity that we live in right now in our society, where you have people who definitely have a good grasp of the truth, but no compassion to go with it, and then people who are just all drippy compassion, but they have no truth to inform their pity. And those two sides are at war with each other right now. And the church understands you have to never compromise the truth, but never compromise love either.
You
Justice
know,
and mercy go together.
that very notion, Dale. I remember. And first of all, I'm going to say I remember. I don't know if it was, and you would probably know better than I. And I could be wrong in this, but was it William F. Buckley or Richard John Newhouse or somebody who had said, when I read Chesterton, I take him in small doses. I read a small amount. I stand up and I walk away and I think about it and I ruminate on it and I come back some other time. There are so many simple quotes that Chesterton will have that will then make me kind of cock my eyebrow and think, now, what does he mean by that? And I'm kind of confused. And as it just kind of settles in later on, or with time and experience, maybe years might pass, there's a time that comes where I'm saying, aha, that makes sense to me. That whole notion about the virtues being cut loose and running wild. Originally, I'm like, well, how could a virtue run wild become problematic? But the point that you're making is there's a chastening effect, a purifying effect of one virtue on the other, and lest you go too far in the justice side or too far in the mercy side, too far in the courage side, too far in the in the temperance side, you become a fundamentalist. Whereas if you have that delicate blend of all the virtues, again, chastening one another, purifying one another, where you arrive at a Christ-like place. It's sort of like Flannery O'Connor's comment where she said, "Conviction without experience leads to harshness. That experience chastens conviction. Well, likewise, the one virtue chastens the other." So to your bringing that up, it's striking to me that a simple comment like that may perplex at first is filled with brilliance the more you consider it, and has a resonance with truth that is very uncommon in the modern day.
Yeah, and it just shows once again that Chesterton is the complete thinker. He really is. He's got his bases covered. People will criticize some line of his, but they've taken it out of context, and they don't realize that he offers the balancing perspective to everything he says. He really puts it all together. That's why he's such a joy to read, and why he's been such a great lifetime companion for me.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Dale, can you've alluded to it, and for our readers who aren't very familiar with Chesterton, can you say a few words about his conversion? As you said, he wrote what I think is described as his spiritual autobiography, Orthodoxy, in 1908, and didn't come into full communion with the church until 1922. I think he was 48 at the time that he became Catholic. What brought Chesterton to the faith as a thinker who seems so formed and so articulate and so insightful at an early stage? He's middle aged before, and I think what is he, 17 years before his death, before he comes into full communion with the church. What brought him to the faith, and what was it that led him to wait till the latter part of his life to arrive?
It's actually only 14 years before his death that
14
he
years.
converted. Yeah. So yeah. Well, it was definitely a long and intellectual and deliberate conversion, and yet when he was asked the question, "Why did you become Catholic?" His answer was, "To get rid of my sins."
Mm,
Only the Catholic Church can do that, and he said, when a man steps out of the confessional, he's 5 minutes old. His whole life has just started over again.
it's wonderful.
And so it's amazing how such a profound singular truth is the one that breaks through. But clearly he describes the three stages of conversion, and you probably can relate to these. He says the first step is that you decide you're going to be fair to the Catholic Church. Not necessarily accept what the church is teaching, but you're not going to immediately take the position of all the things you've heard against the Catholic Church. You're going to be fair to the Catholic Church. He said, but there is no being fair to the Catholic Church. He
Hmm.
says you're either for it or against it, and as soon as you stop being against it, you start being for it. And so that obviously happened early on in Chesterton's um, development of thinking in his writing career, is that he stopped being against the Catholic Church, and clearly he was writing on its behalf early on, early on. But he says then the second stage is simply discovering the Catholic Church, just learning all the things you didn't know about it. He says that's the fun part, and that's what it's like being in a foreign country with all these exotic flowers and butterflies that you'd never heard of, and you're just taking it all in. And the fun part is that there's no commitment at that point, and you can leave anytime you want. And I think for Chesterton, he must have enjoyed that fun part for a long
Yeah.
time, because he with his great mind, he's just always absorbing everything he learns about the Catholic Church without having fully entered it himself. A lot of people became Catholic because of Chesterton's writings before he himself
Right.
became Catholic, which is just an astonishing thing. At one point, he even admitted that he was standing at the door ushering other people into the church without having entered himself. And and of course, one of the people who was so influential in informing him and, you know, catechizing him, as it were, is was a priest named Father John O'Connor,
Hmm.
who became the basis of the Father Brown character. And you know, so without Father O'Connor, Chester never would have found his way to the Catholic Church. And he had several converts around him. His own brother converted um, long before Chesterton did, and I think he was always, you know, he was always drawn to it. One of the things that really held him back was his wife, Frances, did not have any interest in becoming Catholic, and he truly had a very close, and they were in, you know, they were so dependent on one another. For them to do something separately from the other was really unthinkable for him
Sure.
for a long time. But then he says, then comes, he says, the third stage. The third stage is running away from the Catholic Church. It's after your intellect has been convinced, you really have no more objections to it. It becomes a matter of the heart and the will, and that was the thing that he had to take that final step. And what convinced him, that moment that really, when he knew he had to become Catholic, was standing in front of a statue of the Virgin Mary, holding the Christ child, and he said, I have to join the church." And it was still a little longer before he did, but that was when he made the decision he was going to become Catholic. Very
Amazing.
difficult decision to do it without his wife Frances.
And Francis came in ultimately, am I correct?
Yeah, yeah, 4 years after Chesterton converted. So, but she had, you know, she wasn't ready, but she knew that he had to become Catholic. She knew that he was troubled and he would not be at peace until he, you know, she was waiting for him to do it. And and yet, that, you know, that day that he was received was a bittersweet day for both of them, because, you know, she was happy for him because he did what he needed to do. He was happy because he had been received in the Catholic Church. They were both sad because they suddenly didn't share
Yeah.
the most important thing in their lives. They did not share it, and so there were tears and joy at the same time.
Dale, can you say just briefly what it was that finally brought her in, or was it just? I mean, I'm sure it's a profoundly personal, profoundly prayerful process. That how do you describe anyone's journey from the outside? But do you have an insight as to what was the final, among many things, that brought her 4 years later into the church?
Sure, it was among many things, but just like Chesterton had a short answer when he said, you know, "Why did you become Catholic?" He said, "To get rid of my sins."
Hmm.
She was also, the question was put to her, "What made you become Catholic?" And she said, "The devil." And
Oh.
so, yeah, and what's interesting is that, you know, after her conversion, she emerged as a fully mature Catholic, as you know, it was amazing that she really knew the Catholic faith deeply by the time she entered into the church, and
Yeah,
she and her husband were very faithful and devoted Catholics.
incredible. Segment 2. Meet Dale Ahlquist. What sets G.K. Chesterton apart from most modern thinkers is that he makes conclusions. He speaks with confidence, but not with arrogance, about what he believes. He's willing to take a stand and say what the truth is. He's also willing to say what the modern mistakes and errors are. And one of the greatest errors of the modern world is that it will not admit its errors. A society is in decay, Chesterton writes, when common sense has become uncommon. These words may sound familiar to you, Dale, because they come from you in your book, G.K. Chesterton, The Apostle of Common Sense. Let's talk about you, Dale. When did you first encounter G.K. Chesterton?
Well, it's a pretty boring story, Todd. I was just on my honeymoon and I was reading Chesterton.
That's a great place to start.
Yeah, some people have heard this story before, but like so many Baptists, I went to Rome on my honeymoon.
Of course.
Yeah, and we were there the day that Pope John Paul II was shot
Oh, wow.
in May of 1981. So you can see I'm slightly prehistoric myself here, and I, being a Baptist, I was obviously one of the suspects in the shooting, but we we uh, we had our alibi though is that I was reading The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. I was the seed had been planted years before, about 3 years before, when someone said to me, "You'll." I was reading Mere Christianity. Someone said, "Oh, you like C.S. Lewis?" I said, "Oh yeah, I love C.S. Lewis." He says, "Have you ever read G.K. Chesterton?" I said, "I've never heard of G.K. Chesterton." He said, "If you read Chesterton, you won't even need to read C.S. Lewis." What? What? Blasphemy. And he said, because all of C.S. Lewis is in Chesterton.
Love it.
Well, that a comment like that sticks with you.
Yes.
But then as soon as as soon as I'd had that conversation, also I see Chesterton's name everywhere
Yeah.
and see it in C.S. Lewis's own writings. He admitted in his book Surprised by Joy, his memoir of his own conversion to Christianity, that he was an atheist
Mhm.
until he read The Everlasting Man, that was the book that really changed his whole view of everything. He said Chesterton presented the most reasonable defense of Christianity that he'd ever read. And he said a young man who's serious about his atheism cannot be too careful about what he reads.
Love it.
And the more I read, Chesterton, then the more I realized, oh, here's where C.S. Lewis got this, and here's where he got that, and so his own thinking was very, very formed by Chesterton. So that was a neat discovery. But I started with The Everlasting Man, a very difficult introduction to
Yeah.
Chesterton. I wouldn't recommend that for anybody to start because I mean it obviously screwed me up in a bad way, but it's a difficult first read. But it's one of his great books without question. But I'm sure I only grasped about a tenth of it, Todd.
You were like me on the beach, and well,
Yeah.
you're more advanced than that. I'm like, you're Dale Ahlquist. I was just Todd, but
Yeah.
I was like, I remember reading Everlasting Man. I'm like, this is not the easiest read. I'm thinking Dale's probably sailing through it and being transformed. I'm so heartened to know that you struggled a bit with it as well.
Yeah, but of course I was on my honeymoon, so I was all I had.
Okay, enough said. Enough said.
But I remember talking to a gentleman I met from Croatia who was working on translating The Everlasting Man, and he described his first time reading it, saying, I did I did not understand this, but I cannot get enough of it. I
Yeah,
want more."
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's how I felt too. I want more of this. I want more. And so I just got my hands on every Chesterton book I could find. And in 1981, Todd, that meant going to used bookstores
Yeah.
because there were only 6 books of his in print in
Wow.
1981. Only 6.
Wow.
Yeah. And so combing through the used bookstores was a great adventure. There's no internet to
Yeah.
track down
Yeah.
books. And that was fun, and couldn't couldn't get enough. And ended up doing a master's thesis on Chesterton, and and that got me deeper and deeper. But for me, it was a 16-year process from the time I started reading Chesterton to the time I was received into the Catholic Church. So
Wow.
it took Chesterton that long to get me to come to the doors of the church. And so, just like him, I had a very long and intellectual and deliberate conversion as well.
By the way, what was your master's thesis on? What angle were you looking at with
Yeah,
Chesterton?
it was the concept of paradox in Chesterton and
Oh,
Kierkegaard.
wow.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. And Kierkegaard, I learned about Kierkegaard in graduate school because my advisor was a Kierkegaard scholar, and so I was teaching him about Chesterton while he taught me about Kierkegaard. And the two of them really do have essentially the same approach to paradox, which made it a very fun comparison.
One thing I think people who are listening to this, I hope I can say this. When Dale talks about 6 of Chesterton's books being in print up to that point, I hope many people understand Dale has had his hands in the effort and the successful effort at publishing almost everything that Chesterton has to offer in short story form, essay form, poem form, novel form, apologetics form to this day. So there are so many works of Chesterton's that are out there available to those of us who now can access the internet, or go to the Society of G.K. Chesterton, of which Dale is the president, and get access to all the books that Dale could, in part because of Dale's heroic efforts on behalf of the works of Chesterton and keeping his mind and ideas and faith alive for the next subsequent generation. So you would never say that. You're too humble Chestertonian that way. But I want to give serious kudos to you for helping make Chesterton come alive for so many generations since you first discovered him. But that's a quick sidebar I wanted to say. So Dale, so many people have an affinity or an admiration for a person and their ideas or their accomplishments, but you clearly have gone much further and you've dedicated your life to sharing the faith and ideas of Chesterton. Um, Tell us what led to this grand move and grand devotion. I mean, clearly we're influenced by people that we read. How did this become a life's work for you?
Yeah, I had a similar reaction to first reading Chester that other people have felt, especially at that time, was, well, why wasn't I taught this guy in
Yeah.
college? What how did they manage to neglect including him in the curriculum? Here is a great thinker who truly engages all of the ideas that come out of the early 20th century, and yet he's not on the reading list.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of outrage that accompanies that, and yet there's also this joy of discovering something that you want to share with everyone. You want everyone to have the experience that you've just had. Other people have to discover this guy. That was what drove me. That was the passion. When I would run across a great Chesterton quote, which was frequently,
Mhm.
the whole thing was, I want to share this. I want
Yeah.
other people to hear this quote. And I discovered at that time, Todd, that there were other people out there who liked Chesterton, but he was sort of a private pleasure because they didn't want to admit to others because he was so completely off the grid at that point.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to admit that they were reading Chesterton. They were doing it in a closet, and so when we started our very early efforts at being organized, there was a Chesterton Society, a group that met in Milwaukee once a year. And when I discovered them, that was a happy moment. But it was, 25 people sitting on folding chairs who were all 30 years older than me.
Yeah. You weren't sure the future was strong here.
Yeah, and yet they all looked at me like, okay, this is our guy.
Hey, kid.
Yeah.
Hey, Frodo, here's the ring.
Yeah, and they really they were my mentors, and most of them, have gone on to the reward. God rest their souls, but they were the ones who did help usher me into the Catholic Church as well.
That's amazing. It's amazing. In growing the Society of G.K. Chesterton, in publishing Gilbert, the flagship journal of the Society, in hosting annual conferences, writing and lecturing widely, and in creating a network of Chesterton academies for high school students. Dale, you've met countless people whose lives have been touched by this great man, and yet your work has never been about creating a cult of personality around Chesterton, but instead about pointing towards the riches of the Catholic Church and keen Catholic thinking. So how, in your experience, Dale, how have you seen Chesterton change the lives of others?
Well, we certainly have seen the conversions. Both you and I are Catholic today because of our encounter with Chesterton,
Yeah.
and so he has that effect on people's faith and on their whole outlook towards life. I've had people come up to me and say, "Chesterton saved my life."
Mm.
And it's just one moving story after the other. And it's an international phenomenon too, Todd. There's a huge following of Chester in America, but I've had the privilege of lecturing in other countries in Spain and Italy and as well as England and France and Switzerland. And I'll tell you, when I was in Spain, this lady said she had this picture of Chesterton in her home that she was always talking to him. Her maid always assumed that this was her father. But, it showed that, yeah, Chesterton is not just, he's not like an Elvis Presley type of idol that people, have a fanboy thing. It's not cult of personality. We really
Mhm.
believe he's a saint. We really
Mm.
believe that he's one of the folks in the ring around the throne of Christ right now, and when great saints come along, they get a following because what a saint does is he shows us how to live the Christian life, and it's not about him; it's about the truth that he's pointing to.
Yeah.
But he points to it so well that yeah, we want to hear what he has to say because we know there's some insight in there that's going to help our souls as well as feed our intellectual hunger at the same time and give us joy. So Chesterton brings joy along with his deep ideas.
One thing I want to say again, I'm able to look at Dale right now, but everybody can hear it. Dale talks with a smile. He's and I think that's in part just the nature of who you are, but it also speaks to the affinity you have for Chesterton because Chesterton was so winsome. And we'll talk a little bit more about his winsome nature, especially when it comes to debating a little bit later on in our conversation here. But I just want to say you're an extraordinary representative of who Chesterton is and what he thinks because you proceed with joy. Going to a Chesterton conference, by the way, is a raucous, delightful, holy, witty affair. It's not, drudgery and kind of combing through things with fine, just nitpicking on things. It is laughter. It is hope. It is serious debate and discussion on the permanent things. And again, Dale, as you speak with a smile, you live with a smile, and you operate with a smile. You do Chesterton proud on that. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm very blessed. I will say that. I'm very blessed. But as it says in the Mass, we do well always and everywhere to give you thanks.
Yeah,
And that's I think the Chesterton motto right there is always being thankful.
yeah. Hi, I'm Todd Warner, managing editor of Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization and Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization and Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, The Ball and the Cross. G.K. Chesterton tells us, quote, "My first and last philosophy That which I believe in with unbroken certainty, I learned in the nursery. He goes on to say, I left the fairy tales lying on the floor of the nursery, and I have not found any book so sensible since. End quote. Dale, what role does a good story, an anecdote, a short tale, a novel, play in the life and the work of G.K. Chesterton?
Well, you started off well by introducing the fairy tales, because stories stay with us forever. From the time we hear them as children, we always remember them. And the thing about a myth or a fairy tale, uh, as one observer said, it's not that they never happen; it's that they always happen.
Mm,
There's these truths that can only be told, in the form of a story, because that way they stick with us and they keep informing us. Jesus himself spoke in stories. Chesterton says in one of his stories, "I doubt whether any truth can be told except in a parable." In
mm.
a parable, and so the stories play a huge role. And yet Chesterton, being the humble man he was, said, I'm not a novelist. Anybody who's read one of my novels will attest to the fact." And he said, "I I prefer to." He says, some writers can tell their truths through characters. He says, I prefer to have my ideas wrestling naked. Which he was an essayist. He said, but yet, his most famous stuff are the stories he wrote. The Father Brown stories by far exceed everything else that he wrote in terms of
Mm,
popularity.
mm.
And they live on because they're stories. Everybody, and that's what makes them alive. But this, he enjoyed detective stories most of all, both writing them and reading them. But his novels are. He says the thing about a novel is that the word itself means new, right? He said it's not. There really isn't an established form of a novel,
Mm.
and every time you're writing one, you're doing something new. And his novels demonstrate that. He's not following any rules for writing a novel when he writes one.
No, no. Yeah, from the man who was Thursday to the ball and the cross to man alive. I mean, they're unlike anything you'll ever read, and they challenge, but they cross over from science fiction to mystery to whodunit to theology to philosophy weaved in and so on. So it's quite an experience. Let's talk about, and I believe it was 1910. I know it was serialized originally, but the 1910 novel, and Dale, correct me if I'm wrong, The Ball and the Cross. First, where was Chesterton in his Odyssey of Faith when he was writing this book? And then let's start with talking about Professor Lucifer and the monk Father Michael to set up how this book begins.
Okay, yeah, it's a wild ride. Yeah, you're right. He did start serializing it before 1910, but then when he put it all together as a novel, it was slightly different from the serialized version. And it the the way it starts out, is just a complete fantasy. The way it starts out, you're wondering actually what's going on. So you have these two characters in a flying ship over London, and this is not any kind of known flying ship. It's clearly a work of his imagination,
Yeah.
because it's a ship and it's flying, right? And it's not an airplane, as it were. It's not going as fast as an airplane, lolling through the sky, as it were. And the pilot is a monk named Michael, and the other man on the ship who's directing him is a professor named Lucifer. Lucifer and Michael.
Yeah.
I don't know who they represent, but they're clearly in conflict with each other. And at this point, you wonder, what am I reading? What is this? Where is this going to take me? And these two characters, who are very prominent in the first chapter, disappear
Yeah.
for a while, and we don't really meet them again till the end of the novel. The main protagonists end up to be two different characters altogether. But the way it's set up is, Michael gets pushed out of the airship
Hmm.
right on over the St. Paul's Cathedral. and at the top of the cathedral is a cross sitting on top of a ball, and he finds himself hanging from the cross, and but they're arguing even as they approach they're arguing about the ball and the cross,
Yeah.
and those are the two symbols that are at war with each other, and you can't put the ball on top of the cross because it'll fall off, but
Yeah.
the cross can sit on top of the ball, and so Christianity is a different philosophy from the only alternative, which is kind of an Eastern uh, Buddhistic type of nothingness. The eternal swirl, as it were, the thing that keeps returning upon itself like a circle, like the serpent eating its own
Hmm.
tail, right? And so that becomes the symbol. It's the battle between heaven and hell is what this is going to be the conflict in this book.
So Dale, as you've set up brilliantly, and you have as the monk is, Father Michael is up there holding onto this cross and the ball. He makes his way down. He safely gets emerges ultimately onto the London streets, and he finds himself in that moment overwhelmed by grace. And Chesterton writes that Father Michael, the monk Michael, felt the full warmth of that pleasure from which the proud shut themselves out. Now, this is him getting away from this perilous precipice and down into the streets of London, teeming with people. He's safe. So he felt the full warmth of that pleasure from which the proud shut themselves out. The pleasure which not only goes with humiliation, but which almost is humiliation. Men who have escaped death by a hair habit, and men whose love is returned by a woman unexpectedly, and men whose sins are forgiven them. So this is the kind of thing that Chesterton just kind of puts in there, and you read that and you're like, wow, what an insight. And I want to ask you, how does Chesterton weave theology and philosophy so easily into his fiction works, his fantasies and so on? What's your sense about the way he's so deftly able to do that?
Oh, that's a great question because he does it totally naturally,
Yeah.
and part of it is that he is the antithesis to modern education, which has separated everything from everything else. This book is written the same year as What's Wrong with the World is written,
Yeah.
and in that book, he talks about what has happened in the modern world, is particular in education, which is a whole section in that book on education. He says the modern world is one giant divorce court. Everything has been separated from
Mm,
everything else. And Chesterton himself epitomizes the opposite of that, of putting everything together. So your philosophy and your theology should be in everything you do. It should be present in everything you do. And it and we have taken, you can only talk about religion in a separate context. You can only talk about philosophy in a separate context. Economics has its context, and so does science, and so does literature, and they're all their own realm, and don't let any of them mix up with each other. It's one of the it explains why Chesterton himself um, fell out of the public eye, because he fell out of the academic world, because there was no department to put him into.
good one.
He did write about everything, and he combined literature and theology and philosophy, but too much of one for that department, so they threw him out of that department, one out of every department, one at a time. He could be taught in every department and should be, and yet he's been excluded from all of them. So yeah, what your question, how did you do it? That's the natural way to do it.
Yeah.
That's the right way to do it. And the whole world does it the opposite.
Interestingly, yeah, to your point, if we are operating in this world and accustomed to a very reductionist, siloed approach to things, and we come across someone who thinks comprehensively and especially integrates appropriately what should never have been segregated, which is faith with life. Almost, it's a little bit like, whoa, it's like, can he do that? And oh my gosh, it's almost scandalous that he's bringing God up, or at least something philosophical or theological point or what have you. And yet you stop for a second and say, yeah, actually that's right. That feels right. And that's what's so liberating about so much of what we read about with Chesterton. So we have, as you said, so Michael and Lucifer kind of sort of disappear a little bit from the scene. And then with the smash of a storefront window, we meet the fiery atheist editor James Turnbull and the equally spirited Catholic Highlander Evan MacIan. Who are these two firebrands?
So here's Chesterton, 12 years before he becomes a Catholic, and he has a Catholic hero in his book, MacIan, but he has his adversary, Turnbull, who's the atheist. And Chesterton gives such respect to both characters. He doesn't make either one of them a caricature.
Yeah.
Turnbull he doesn't come off as a bad guy. He comes out as a fervent believer in his unbelief, right?
Yeah.
But a dignified man and a fair-minded man, and the two of them are in conflict with each other, and that's going to be the tension of the novel for the next 3/4 of the novel. That is that tension between the believer and the unbeliever. But Chesterton treats them both respectfully. But yeah, they're very amusing characters, and Turnbull, Turnbull actually comes off as the more human of the two,
Mm-hmm.
And MacIan, the idealist who seems a little bit detached at times from things, but he's so true to his ideals that he's willing to challenge Turnbull to a duel.
Yeah, and so this duel ensues and or tries to ensue between these two men. And as you read through this book, you find this duel is repeatedly interrupted by pursuing police, by curious onlookers, by meddling clinicians. What is the nature? And you've talked about kind of the corners of the ring that each one of them is coming from. How would you kind of characterize the nature of this great debate, and why, in their eyes, they find it is worth dying for?
Yeah, well, that's what's so much fun. It says, they're trying to have a duel so that one of them can kill the other.
They spend so much time trying to affect the other's death, but they spend so much time together in this process.
Yeah, and so because they spend so much time together, they're carrying on the real duel, which is the intellectual and spiritual duel.
Right.
And so it's this debate that we're following, and that is, that's the meat of the novel, is the debate, the ongoing debate. As they are trying to find just a quiet place to have a sword fight.
So Dale, do you find when you're and I love the fact that you said Chesterton effectively dignified Turnbull, the atheist, so as not to make him a caricature, because again, and I think that's always been the approach that Chesterton had with his opposites in debates, is that he gave them the respect they were due for being thinkers. They may have crummy ideas, but he was going to give them the best version, respect the best version of their ideas, the best intentions behind those ideas, and so on. If you were to kind of say in so many words what you think Turnbull's approach was, or his best argument was, and MacIan's counter best argument in this debate that kind of was pursued all the way across England and so on, what would you say? Could you box up a little bit of MacIan's best argument and Turnbull's best arguments, and how they were at loggerheads?
Wow, that's a good one. That's a great question, Todd. I like that question. You can write a whole thesis on
I
that.
know.
Yeah.
Any listeners out there, there's something to start on.
The funny thing is that what occurs to me, just my immediate reaction to that question, is that while they both have their intellectual positions they take, what the ultimate thing with both of them is that it's a matter of faith. With both of them, it's a matter of faith.
Yeah.
The one, his faith in God and in the church, and the other, his faith in the materialist explanation of the world with no God in it, no miraculous, and that's the ultimate conflict, is two positions that are matters of faith, and it's in both cases they shore it up with reason.
Yeah.
But I think I'm trying to think what they're great. I'm gonna have to consider that some more. Next question.
Yeah, no, reasonable. And that's that's a tough one. Like I said, this is thesis material, and I know you could do it. So, but yeah, no. Well, then let me ask you this: as they're having these debates, and every so often swinging the sword a couple times, then being chased again, and having to get on the run, what's happening? What becomes of their relationship as they move forward?
Yeah, well, of course, they continue now to gain respect for
Yeah.
each other, and ironically start caring for the other person's welfare. They don't
Yeah.
want anything to happen to the
Before they
other
kill him.
before they kill him, right? So they're protecting each other, and so that's a wonderful development in the plot. Then, of course, and then the other thing is that Turnbull goes and falls in love at
Yes.
a certain point, and that's I think one of the great episodes in the book because he naturally falls in love with a Catholic girl,
Of course.
and he's hanging out in the church, waiting to talk to her, and she finally notices him and says, you must be a great believer," she says to him, that in effect, because you're here every day. and and they in their conversation that follows, you have one of the best defenses of the Eucharist that you're going to
Yeah.
read anywhere. And this is written by Chesterton before he's Catholic, but he says, and all the other sacraments too of confession, because he admits to her that he's a fraud and that he's not who he is pretending to be,
Right.
and um and she says, well, she goes, that's okay if you're sorry. That's good. It's good to be sorry. And if you're very sorry, all you have to do is go and tell the priest, and he will give you God out of his hand. and he says that, and he just starts, mocking her faith. At the same time, he doesn't want to hurt her because he loves her. But he said, I'm saying all the wrong things. But he said, you didn't. There is no God. He says, oh no, there is a God. I touched him this morning.
Yeah.
She said.
Yeah.
He says, oh, you just touched a bit of bread. And she says, well, you think it's just a bit of bread, but um, if you think that, why didn't you have some yourself?
Yeah. It's
you know,
amazing. It's amazing. So I was going to actually ask you to offer that anecdote. And again, these are what's amazing is how Chesterton just slides this in. Um, I mean, it's theology embedded in narrative, and it's not kind of a kitschy theology. It just seems very, very natural. One thing I want to ask Dale is, um, there's part of this that remind me. So when the Heretics, as I understand Heretics, I think Chesterton wrote that in 1905, and wrote effectively a chapter dedicated to a number of the fashionable thinkers of the day and kind of his misgivings with their philosophy, basically. And then he was criticized, saying, "Well, Chesterton, I'll mind my own philosophy or change my own philosophy when Chesterton offers us his, and then orthodoxy comes out of it 3 years later." There's an aspect of other notable figures that are encountering Turnbull and MacIan throughout this novel that seem to represent various fashionable thoughts, fashionable philosophies of the day as they go along, and we get to see kind of how those kind of manifest themselves in the eyes of Chesterton and how they're rebutted by either Turnbull or by MacIan. Can you say a little bit about maybe are there any figures or any mindsets that Chesterton is trying to represent in these individuals that are coming through, and what is Chesterton trying to represent effectively? What's the point he's trying to make with some of these individuals that encounter MacIan and Turnbull in their duel?
yeah, you make a good point that even Turnbull can see the flaws in the thinking of some of these other characters who are that they encounter along the way. Um, and yeah, he just has a whole variety of types that they encounter, from strange idealists to practical businessmen to what have you. And what's funny is that in some way they represent the world, uh, which is a very shallow. They're shallow thinkers. They're uh, they all are objecting to this thing of this duel, that anybody would die for their beliefs. They're all just repelled by that,
Right.
uh, and so this is Chesterton's group that he really wants to convert.
Yeah.
The atheists are easy. It's the people who are lukewarm or who are just caught on one bad idea.
Yeah.
They're the tough crowd, and they're the hardest to deal with. the atheists are fun because they do want to debate their ideas,
Yeah.
and you could have an engaging discussion with an atheist because the atheist is dogmatic and he wants to defend his dogma, and that's why that's a fun encounter. But there's the people who don't want to really talk about it, who are so closed in their thinking and in their non-thinking that that's the real trial and the real struggle. And incidentally, they're the ones who, in many ways, are the followers of Lucifer,
Yeah.
right? At the end, they all come out in various ways to be supportive of the devilish ideas.
It's a great point that you make there, Dale. That along the way, it's these two again, fiery figures, Turnbull and MacIan, going against each other, and yet they find themselves having more and more in common as they listen to the arguments and ideas of these people they encounter, and it's almost like Turnbull and MacIan look at each other and they kind of shake their head. They're like, now they might come at it from a little bit different angle, but then they start finding the commonality, certain themes they have about dogma, about truth, about fastidiousness in argumentation, about reason, and so on. That these people that they keep encountering don't seem to have, and it seems obviously it's part of the arc of their relationship with each other as they grow closer and closer, as they see all these other outside lukewarm ideas or odd ideas that make them further find common ground with one another.
But I think the other irony, and you probably know this in your own atheist associates, is that they're always very moral people.
Yeah.
They have very, atheists have very strong morals. They don't. They have no basis for their morality.
Yeah.
But they're usually very admirable people and honorable and have a sense of loyalty, and that's why they're engaging debaters too, because they usually are respectful. Very rare is the atheist who is completely amoral and just attacks everything, because that's the right position atheists should have. He has no devotion to anything. Why should he?
Yeah.
If there are no consequences to our actions, if we are just blobs of the universe, why should we even bother being respectful of anything? And yet you'll find that generally the atheist is not that way. Whereas the immoral people are the ones who haven't worked out their faith. And those are some of the characters that we encounter in the book. Those are the ones who are immoral.
Yeah.
And that's why they end up, with Lucifer.
So without giving spoilers as to the end, what take, if you were to kind of characterize, and we talked about some of this, but would you say anything about a takeaway point or points that you think Chesterton's hoping to get across to his readers in The Ball and the Cross?
Well, here's what I've said about the book before. I said that he does all the things that Dostoevsky does in The Brothers Karamazov in this book. It's the battle between heaven and hell. It's the common struggles of humanity together with each other. And what's the one character in the brothers' case says that the soul, all of life is this battle between God and the devil, and the soul is the battlefield, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what's happening in The Ball and the Cross. Chesterton says at one point, your soul, anybody's soul, matters so much more than what the world says about anybody. So Chesterton does everything that Dostoevsky does, except he does it with humor, and he does it 700 pages less.
Well said. So the brothers, everybody should read The Brothers Karamazov. But if you're looking for a beach read, you might go with The Ball and the Cross and save Brothers Karamazov for a winter weekend or what have you.
Yeah. Brothers K winter and Ball and the Cross summer. Yeah.
Segment 4: The Debate Over Truth. In Common Sense 101, Lessons from G.K. Chesterton, you, Dale, write, quote, Chesterton writes and writes and fights to the very end of his life. His dying thoughts are as lucid as his living thoughts. The issue is clear, Chesterton insists. It is between light and darkness, and everyone must choose his side. And Dale, you close with this. We must choose our side, then we must join the fight. So, The Ball and the Cross is a book about debate over the highest things, filled with understandings and misunderstandings, parting ways and common ground. This story insists on the fact that there is a truth and that it is worth fighting for. So, Dale, I know we've alluded to it, but what is the state of debate today over the highest things? Are we tired? Are we complacent? Are we uninformed? How goes the battle for truth in an ideological world?
Well, I think one of the reasons why this book needs to be read is because it brings the debate out into the open. Because the debate really isn't happening right now. The two sides aren't talking to each other, and that's because, well, we live in an essentially, it's not official, but it is essentially an atheist society. People don't want to talk about religion. Religion has to be kept in its place. It has to be kept quiet. Even the argument between belief and unbelief has to be kept quiet, which is what they were trying to do in the Ball and the Cross. They were trying to keep that duel from happening, keep that argument from happening. Just keep it quiet.
Mm.
And Chesterton's point is, if it were brought out in the open, the world might come to an end. And without giving anything
Yeah.
away, we do get we have an ultimate conflict in the book because the debate comes out into the open. And it explains, I think, a lot about why Chesterton himself was kept quiet in the period following his death, when the world was in just a deep turmoil. World War II,
Yeah.
the Holocaust, the Cold War, the rise of just materialism in everything, both in terms of people's consumerism, but also in the philosophies that were being taught in our schools, and the lack of Chesterton's voice being heard. And he continues to be kept quiet today. We're blessed that there's this grassroots movement that is discovering not only his great arguments, but his great holy life and influence. Because if he does rise to prominence again, we could be leading them towards the ultimate conflagration, as it were. And it also explains why the debate is, as it happens in the book, the debate is seen as insane. MacIan and Turnbull are regarded as insane, and that's how they're dealt with. And we are dismissed as being something mentally off by standing up for the truth in our society right now. It's best to regard us as insane, and that way we don't have to be engaged rationally. So the state of debate today is that it's not happening, that we're dismissed out of hand, we're not taken seriously. The only counter measure to that is to have an effect where we are locally, to start the fire at the local level and see how far that fire burns. And so Chesterton is, as the spokesman for the common man is starting to get Chesterton, and that's the voice that isn't heard. That's why common sense isn't heard, or isn't common anymore. We really have a model to follow here with Chesterton, and he does have all the counter arguments for everything we're facing in the modern world right now, as a true spokesman for the truth.
Dale, that was so well said. I really appreciate your emphasis on, which I sometimes fell away from because I was caught up in the debate between Turnbull and MacIan. Your emphasis on the attempt to silence and ultimately to declare lunacy. So either to shut up this argument, to declare it insane, or to even say it never happened. And to your point, one of the things I can say about that drew me into Catholicism was when I started to engage with it, not with the stereotypes with which I had lived with for some time and dismissing it, but when I started to engage with it along the lines of what you said, that Chesterton said about once you're fair to it, you become fond of it. I was struck by the quiet genius that I'd never heard, and sort of like what you said about Chesterton. Why am I not hearing more about this? I think the Catholic faith wants to have the debate. The Catholic faith wants to have a conversation about what's the nature of man and woman. What is the destiny that we have? What's the state of our souls, and what are the roles of prayer and sacraments, and our appetites and our laws and so on. Let's have it all out there. And the modern world just wants to say, be quiet. We don't want to air this out. And I think that sometimes is a representative also why so many times when there are people out there that want to give talks or speeches or whatever, and they're shouted down or they're canceled or they're threatened or fire alarms are pulled, is simply because if that truth gets out, it could be very threatening to the prevailing ideology of the day. And so I think that notion of the characters of the authorities in the suppression of this duel, of this debate, it wasn't just about maintaining civility, it was about maintaining silence and frankly, complicity with the larger, zeitgeist of the day or mindset of the day and so on. So I really appreciate you emphasizing that. I want to go one step further on debate quickly, and that is as a debater himself, Chesterton was wise and he was witty. He was able to sharply duel with the brightest minds without getting petty or vindictive, and in effect, he never let a quarrel get into the way of an argument. What can we learn? So if the debate is going to happen, if the debate is going to get some airtime, what can we learn from Chesterton about discussing and debating with those we disagree with, while simultaneously willing the good for them and trying to bring them to Christ?
Well, the reason why Chesterton had all these successful debates because these people were willing to debate with him because they had such an affection for Chesterton.
Yeah.
He did not have enemies. He had intellectual opponents, but they were his friends. And Chesterton's own very good friend Belloc could not understand that about Chesterton. Belloc could not stand H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells was a very immoral man. But Chesterton and Wells would spend weekends together at each other's houses. They enjoyed each other's company. But when Chesterton died, Wells said to Chesterton's widow, if there's any chance of me getting into heaven, it's going to be because I was a friend of G.K. Chesterton.
Yeah.
So that's how we have to behave as saints. We have to gain the respect of our opponents by loving them. And the reason we want to debate them is not to defeat them, but to convert them. We want them to be on our side. So if our goal is to get these people who in many ways we can't stand, who are abhorrent to us because of their views and because of the things that they've done and said, if our attitude is that we want them on our side, how can we bring them over? Well, that has to be motivated by real love, genuine love. You care about their souls, and their souls are important. That was Chesterton's motivation in debate. Yeah, the intellectual stuff is good, but it's ultimately about love. One of his great passages comes from an early essay. It's in the book 12 Types, and he talks about Nehemiah. Nehemiah, one of those characters from the Bible that certainly no Catholics are familiar with, but even the Protestants don't know that much about Nehemiah. He was after the fall of Jerusalem, he was going to go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and he's rebuilding, and he has all of his workers with a sword in one hand and a trowel in the other. Chesterton points out that the sword is the weapon of reason, and you defend yourself with reason, but you can't build anything with a sword. The creative tool is the trowel, and that's the tool of love, because that's what builds. So we don't convert anybody with the sword. We can defend ourselves if we're attacked, and that's what the purpose of reason is to defend, a reasonable defense of the faith. That's what apologetics is. It's using reason to defend the faith. But evangelization is the work of love. So be ready to defend your faith using not using a well-formed knowledge of the faith. But if we combine it with some wit and some humor, then we open a door that is inviting, and Chesterton is able to do that. He uses his great reason, but he does it in a witty and inviting way. So he knows what to do with that sword. He's always got the trowel ready to build up the church and build up the kingdom of God.
Fantastic. So, Dale, in a final question for you, which I think you're well versed to answer. So, how can someone intrigued by the keen and wondrous mind of Chesterton learn more? Where do they start? Where do they go? What advice would you give them?
Well, certainly go to our website, chesterton.org. Don't go to chesterton.com. You'll get hydraulic valves.
Which you may need to, but go to
Which you may need.
chesterton.org. Yeah.
Yeah. But Chesterton.org has lots of inviting information about Chesterton. We certainly encourage people to join the Chesterton Society. You get Gilbert Magazine, great magazine. And the books to read, I've written, you've alluded to two of them already, the Apostle of Common Sense and Common Sense 101 are really designed to be good introductions to Chesterton. They will open the whole world to his own books, but my books about Chesterton are largely just quoting Chesterton. So, I'm called the author of those books, but all I do is dodge between Chesterton quotes.
You assemble them so well. It is such a wonderful and comprehensive introduction that only a few people could ever accomplish, and you're the foremost of them. So I would highly second that recommendation. Well, Dale Ahlquist, thinker, writer, and champion of all things Chesterton, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure talking with you.
A pleasure for me too, Todd. Your questions were far better than my answers.
So I've been thinking, as Professor Lucifer and Father Michael hovered in the professor's flying ship over Christopher Wren's architectural masterpiece that is London's St. Paul's Cathedral, they were momentarily quiet. Atop the cathedral spire was the familiar shape of a ball with a cross perched on top of it. Scowling, Professor Lucifer disdains this obvious mistake. The cross, he says, is on top of the ball. That is surely wrong. The ball should be on top of the cross. The cross is a mere barbaric prop. The ball is perfection. The cross, at its best, is but the bitter tree of man's history. The ball is the rounded, the ripe and final fruit, and the fruit should be at the top of the tree and not at the bottom of it. To all of this, Father Michael smiles and says, in that case, you would see a most singular effect, an effect that has generally been achieved by all of those able and powerful systems which rationalism or the religion of the ball has produced to lead or teach mankind. You would see, I think, that thing happen, which is always the ultimate embodiment and logical outcome of your logical scheme. When Lucifer tersely and impatiently asks Father Michael what would happen, Father Michael wistfully answers, I mean, it would fall down. The Ball and the Cross is first and foremost a novel about meaningful debate, a practice that is in desperately short supply today. Oh, there's arguing and fighting, disputing and disagreeing, yelling and screaming, but there's very little debate. Because true debate first requires a few uncompromising points of agreement. Both sides must listen. Both sides must be respectful. Both sides must keenly strive to understand and rebut the other side. And most importantly, both sides must strive, without fail, to arrive at or closer to ultimate truth, even if it proves their own side wrong. The Ball and the Cross, to be sure, is a novel about opposing viewpoints between dueling personalities and others who insert themselves and their worldviews into the discussion. But the more ominous battle is between those who want to have, find it worthy to have, debate about the most important questions of our time, and those who want to crush that debate and impose a totalitarian, uniform, and uncompromising worldview that will brook no dissent. And what is the nature of the questions that we are talking about? Nothing less than the highest things. Is there a God? What is the nature of man? What is right and what is wrong? How should I relate to my fellow man? Throughout this novel and to its ultimate end, the enemy is not the debate itself, even though we as Catholics disagree with the atheistic materialism of James Turnbull. Rather, The enemies are the authorities who undermine free will with the intent to impose an ideology. Now, those who are skeptical about Catholicism are going to leap in and say, aha, the enemy is the overbearing and inquisitorial Catholic Church, crushing our free will and imposing their own version of truth. But sadly, my friend, you would be wrong. The Church is the custodian of truth, arrived at by reason and revelation. But the Church, in recognizing the God-kissed dignity of each man, woman, and child, also recognizes that along with dignity comes the gift of free will. Free will is the liberty to choose right or to choose wrong, and to engage in debate and discussion, prayer and petition to arrive at what is right and to leave wrong behind. But free will means a choice between right and wrong, true and false, not a choice to craft a truth of your own making. In offering truth through Scripture and sacraments, the Church does not compel, it invites. The authorities in the ball and the cross are the secular ideologies and philosophies that rob us of our dignity, befuddle us in our calling, mire us in our suffering, and distract us from God's graces. They want to impose, not invite. They want debate to cease so that daylight cannot expose the rot that is hidden in the darkness of ideology. The ball and the cross simply picks up what G.K. Chesterton so capably did in his two earlier works, Heretics and Orthodoxy. And what did Chesterton do in these two masterpieces? In Heretics, he debated with those with whom he disagreed, and in Orthodoxy, he affirmed that which he does in fact believe. And then he published these books so that you and I can join in the debate. The Ball and the Cross is a novel about debates. Long live the good and honest fight. And one last thing. For this week's book, I would recommend G.K. Chesterton's Heretics. It gives you a sense of Chesterton's puckish wits and incisive arguments against that fashionable and often flawed thinking of the day. If you were to intelligently answer the progenitors of today's ideologies and opinions, who would they be? And what would you say? Not a bad exercise, because our children and our children's children would benefit from your thoughtful and reasoned witness about the most important questions of the day. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization and Culture podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.